So with that, we're going over to Oregon to Gigi, and I will put up on the screen for people to follow along. Gigi, all yours.
Thank you, David. Gigi Alcoholic, Chapter 13 from Writing the Big Book by Bill Shaberg. This Week Magazine, September to October 1938. It had been 3 full months since Bill Wilson had written any new material for the book. It wasn't that absolutely no progress had been made on the project, but it was minimal at best. Bill rather lamely admitted to Dr. Bob on August 29th that, quote, a little more has been done on the book, but not much, close quote. And he similarly told Don McLean on September 8th that, quote, some more progress has been made on the book, close quotes, but he offered no further details. Perhaps this was because whatever recent progress there may have been was in relation to their efforts to confirm the acceptability of what Bill had written so far, and to establish that, once finished, the book would prove to be as marketable as they hoped it would be.
Sometime in mid-June, Wilson and Parkhurst solicited a professional opinion on the first 2 chapters during a visit to Floyd Parsons, parenthesis, the former Saturday Evening Post writer, close parenthesis, who pronounced the book to be a worthy effort and agreed to help with editing once it was finished. Best of all, Hank and Bill left with the writer's commitment to do an article once the book was published, along with his confident assurance that he would be able to get that story placed in the Saturday Evening Post. On August 3rd, Wilson wrote Parsons a belated thank you note asking him to, quote, forgive my tardiness in acknowledging the pleasure which Mr. Parkhurst and I had in your company the other day, end quote, and sending him copies of Dr. Silkworth's and Dr. Richards' letters, quote, for your further information, end quote. This was really little more than a courtesy letter, clearly intended to reassure Parsons that the book was still a viable project and reiterating how much Bill appreciated his offer of assistance in promoting it.
Ongoing edits to the 2 chapters.
The only other progress Wilson might possibly claim was the ongoing cosmetic edits to the first 2 chapters. While the overall format of There Is a Solution and Bill's story remained fundamentally the same over these 3 months, Bill continued to make small revisions to the text every time Ruth had to retype them. The changes were mostly confined to small additions or deletions as he tried to sharpen the impact of his sentences and to clarify the message he was trying to deliver. Commenting on this particular part of the process, Ruth Hawk later noted,
there were thousands of small changes and rewrites, constantly cutting or editing or adding.
Ruth also claimed that she retyped these chapters, quote, at least 50 times, end quote.
For example, there are 3 early versions of just 1 paragraph from There Is a Solution showing the progressive edits which were made with each retyping. Parentheses state here, deletions from the previous versions are noted by strikeouts, and additions appear in bold italics.
Stepping Stones, version 1, June 1938. If by chance you are, or have begun to suspect that you are, an alcoholic, we think there is no tenable middle-of-the-road solution. You are in a position where life is becoming impossible, and if you have passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, you have just 2 alternatives. One is to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of your intolerable situation as best you can. Or you can surely find what we have found if you honestly want to and are willing to pay the price. After years of living on a basis which now seems to us wholly false, you are not going to get rightly related to your Creator in a minute. None of us has found God in 6 easy lessons, but he can be found by all who are willing to put the task ahead of all else.
Stepping Stones, version 2, June through September, with a question mark, 1938. If by chance you are, or have begun to suspect that you are, an alcoholic, we think there is no tenable has been crossed out and replaced with you have no middle-of-the-road solution. You are in a position where life is becoming impossible, and if you have passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, you have just 2 alternatives. One is to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of your intolerable situation as best you can. Or you can surely find what we have found if you honestly want to and are willing to pay the price. After years of living on a basis which now seems to us has been stricken out, wholly false, and then the words "you are not going to get" have again been crossed out and replaced with "we did not become rightly related to your Creator in a minute. None of us," and they added "have found God in 6 easy lessons who are willing to put the task ahead of all else." And then they added, "that goes for you too." The
GSO version,
September,
June
again a
to
question mark,
September.
1938.
All yours, Jim.
If by chance you are or have begun to suspect that you are an alcoholic, we think you have no middle of the road solution. You are in a position where life is becoming impossible. And if you have passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, you have, the word "but" is crossed out, you have just 2 alternatives. One is to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of your intolerable situation as best you can. Or you can surely find what we have found if you honestly want to and are willing to. The phrase "pay the price" is stricken out and replaced with "make the effort." We are willing to make, if you are willing to make the effort. After years of living on a basis which now seems wholly false, we did not become rightly related to our Creator in a minute. None of us have found God in easy lessons, but He can be found by all who are willing to put the task ahead of all else. And the following sentence has been stricken out. That goes for you too. Throughout these 3 versions, the number of words remained fairly constant. 156, 155, and 146 respectively. But the impact of the language has changed subtly. For instance, with the dropping of the too cliched 6 from the easy lessons comment, and the addition and subsequent deletion of the pointed accusation "that goes for you too." From Bill Wilson's perspective, it was important that he continue to sharpen the text as much as possible, but at this time, there was no pressing need for him to begin writing any new chapters. These 2 served their primary purpose as promotional pieces in June, July, and August, and Bill continued to use them throughout the rest of 1938 as his opening wedge for securing appointments with some of the most important and prestigious men in New York and Washington.
Fundraising efforts continue.
As usual, Bill set the sights high. In early September, he prevailed upon his old employer, Clayton Quall, to join him and Hank Parkhurst for a preliminary meeting with Frederick Yeager, the private secretary to Thomas W. Lamont, the senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Yeager was enthusiastic about their proposal, and he was confident Lamont would respond positively. But after this auspicious beginning, the head of J.P. Morgan disappointed them all, telling his secretary to write Wilson how, quote, he regrets that he is unable to offer any assistance because the enterprise is entirely out of his bailiwick, end quote. Returning the package of documents to Wilson, Yeager consoled him with his, quote, personal regrets that the negotiations proved unsuccessful, end quote, and suggested Bill might have better luck if he approached, quote, the personnel executive of large organizations where such matters come under their personal supervision, end quote. This was little more than a polite brush-off, with just a bit of sympathy thrown in to soften the blow. It is difficult to understand why Wilson and Parkhurst were so consistently unsuccessful with the rich men they approached in New York City during the summer and fall of 1938. Bill was upset by these repeated failures, complaining that, quote, it is inconceivable for us when we observe the amounts of money raised for other purposes that we cannot quite readily secure adequate funds to carry forward a work of the probable importance of this one. Obviously, we had not yet discovered how to go about it. We simply have not reached the right people in the right way." End quote. Wilson's frustration is understandable, but just how likely is it that all these men would have been so completely deaf to the worthiness of the cause they were promoting? Perhaps the problem wasn't that Hank and Bill hadn't found the right people or the right way. Perhaps it was the successes they were so proud of, the early contribution from John D. Rockefeller Jr., and their current alliance with his closest associates, that were the very source of their undoing. The community of the rich is small and incestuous, and it is not inconceivable that one response to learning of Rockefeller's support for AA would be to wonder why John D. hadn't come up with a larger donation himself, if he was so convinced about the worthiness of this cause. After all, Wilson and Parkhurst weren't looking for that much money, only something like $30,000, an amount that was little more than pocket change to Rockefeller. Had word of the fact that Rockefeller thought money would spoil the project already become so well known among the New York elite that it provided them with a ready-made excuse for saying no without any fear of troubling their conscience? In the face of the universal and summary rejection of all their appeals, this may well have been the case. Even more ambitious than his hopes at J.P. Morgan were Bill's plans for 2 meetings he encouraged Fitz to set up in Washington, D.C. Before the Judge Casey project completely unraveled, Wilson encouraged Mayo to make contact with Stanley Woodward and Colonel Edwin Watson, 2 important members of the White House staff, and convince them they should attend the meeting then being organized by the judge. This was shooting very high indeed. Colonel Watson was President Roosevelt's personal military aide, and Woodward was the White House chief of protocol. 2 men who were not just in daily contact with the President of the United States, but also well known to be among his closest personal friends. Could Bill Wilson have had any greater hopes for the proposed Washington, D.C. meeting than to have it attended by 2 men who shared the confidential ear of Franklin Delano Roosevelt? But all of this came to naught. Despite these grandiose plans and all their efforts, by late September, Wilson was forced to admit that he was, quote, rather ashamed to say that outside of Mr. Towns' generous contributions, we have not secured a red cent, end quote. The game plan they had been following for the past several months was obviously not working, nor was there any real hope that it would start working in time to relieve the growing desperation of their current financial situation. A completely different approach was clearly needed. Not surprisingly, Henry G. Parkhurst had a plan.
Hank approaches Silas Bent about a This Week magazine article.
Predictably, Hank's new plan had to do with promotion and fundraising. His scheme hinged on the wide circulation of a story praising their work and his certainty that such publicity would generate tens of thousands of inquiries from the public. But it was the second half of his proposal that proved to be the most important. He claimed that once this well-placed article had put them in touch with a huge and receptive audience, they would then respond to all inquiries by offering several chapters from the soon-to-be finished book for just $1. Parenthesis, quote, the price of a pint of cheap whiskey, end quote, close parenthesis, thereby raising enough money to finance the writing of the rest of the book. Floyd Parsons had promised them national exposure in the Saturday Evening Post once the book was published, but what they desperately needed right now was enough cash to support themselves while they wrote, edited, and published the book. Bill, Hank, and Fitz were flat broke and quickly slipping deeper into debt as they struggled to cover their regular household expenses. Something had to be done immediately, and Hank's plan for capitalizing on this proposed wide-ranging publicity sounded like the best way to raise money quickly maximizing the resources they already had at hand. One of their members, Silas Bent, had a working relationship with This Week magazine, a syndicated Sunday supplement distributed locally by the New York Herald Tribune. This magazine had a weekly nationwide circulation of over 5 million copies, and Hank was sure an article in This Week was the perfect vehicle for producing publicity they so desperately needed. How could they fail to raise money once they had received such penetrating national exposure? Bill had met Silas Bent in Towns Hospital in November of 1935 and helped him become the third sober member of their group in New York City. But less than a year later, Silas had a spectacular slip, drinking himself into a stupor that lasted for several weeks before his wife placed a desperate phone call to Wilson. Bill took the next train from Grand Central to Old Greenwich, Connecticut, and found his friend practically unconscious and in seriously deteriorated state. In a panic, Wilson called a cab and dashed the drunken and dangerously ill man down to Towns Hospital, where Dr. Silkworth pronounced Bent to be on death's door, holding out little hope for his survival. Silas, however, like many drunks, quickly proved the doctor's prediction wrong by making an amazingly quick and full recovery. The next time Silas shows up in the records is the long letter Bill wrote to Dr. Bob Smith in late June of 1938, reporting on Bent's glowing opinion of the 2 chapters just written and his high hopes for the proposed book. Wilson reinforced Bent's credibility as a critic by reminding Bob that Silas was, quote, a star reporter and writer who, quote, was at one time editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine, end quote. Whatever his past writing accomplished, and they were in fact considerable, Bent was at this time regularly supplying copy to the quote-unquote page 2 feature in This Week magazine. Hank approached Silas and suggested he make a more substantial contribution by writing a full-length article about their success in getting people sober. Hank also mentioned that whatever Silas might write, he should include a paragraph that would, quote-unquote, guardedly disclose their need for funds, end quote. Once this article was read by, quote, several 100,000 families where the alcoholic problem exists, end quote, AA would surely receive a huge number of requests for information and help, providing Bill and Hank with an opportunity to sell copies of the already written chapters to many of the people who wrote for help and thereby raise the money needed for their ongoing support. Hank had no doubt that if Silas wrote and submitted such an article, it would be published. And he was not too far wrong. By mid-September, Bent had finished the piece and submitted it to Gerald Mygott, the managing editor of This Week magazine. Mygott responded enthusiastically on September 19th, saying that, quote, personally, I think it's most interesting, end quote, and he promised Bent a prompt answer once the publisher and the owner of the magazine found the time to read it. On the same day that Mygott, writing his first response to him, on the same day that Mygott was writing this first response to him, Hank, Bill, and Lois drove out to Old Greenwich for a talk with Silas about the Tribune article. If they were about to receive such massive favorable national exposure, then they needed to formulate a plan for handling the deluge of requests for help, which would surely be generated by this publicity. It would be interesting to know more about these conversations. Unfortunately, we have no records that have survived, but given the typical over-the-top optimism of the participants in that discussion, we can only presume the plans they made that day were both ambitious and elaborate. The need for such planning, however, was called into question the very next day when Mygott raised the first of several complications. He wrote to Silas telling him that the publisher had now read the article, quote-unquote, with interest, but they both felt that something important was missing. Would it be possible, he asked, quote, to incorporate in the article a description of how the cure works, end quote?
What it boils down to is that you tell us and the reader that this new cure exists, and then don't tell us anything about it. Could this be written in the first person by some man who has actually gone through the process? Such an article would be extremely valuable to us and extremely interesting to any reader with an alcoholic problem anywhere on the horizon. As it stands, Mr. Field, the publisher, and I agree the piece fails to hammer its real interest home. And the real interest lies, perforce, in the process, rather than in the fact that, quote, there is hope, unquote. I will hold the peace here, awaiting your reply.
This was very bad news indeed. While they already had such a first-person account in Bill's story, they didn't want to publish that in the magazine. Instead, that was exactly what they were hoping to sell to the interested parties who read the magazine article. In addition, Bill had not yet written any general description of how the Q works, a labor that would prove to be the greatest single challenge of his life and perhaps his most important accomplishment. But at this point, Wilson was still almost 3 months away from his first serious attempt to produce a comprehensive explanation of how the cure actually worked. Silas passed along copies of this correspondence to Bill and suggested they had reached an impasse that only he could resolve. Quote, I believe the best thing for you to do is to see Gerald Magat, but you must make an appointment to the minute. He just can't drop in on this guy. Even so, he may keep you waiting, end quote. In short, all of the problems of revising the article to the publisher's satisfaction had now been dropped directly in Bill Wilson's lap.
The third foundation meeting, the lack of money. But Bill Wilson had more pressing problems to deal with first. At 3 p.m. on Friday, September the 23rd, just 2 days after Silas's report of the problems with This Week article, Wilson made a dramatic presentation of their desperate need for money at the third meeting of the Alcoholic Foundation at the Rockefeller Center. In attendance were Willard Richardson, Frank Amos, A. Leroy Chipman, and Hank Parkhurst. Absent were John Wood, Bill Rudell, who sent a proxy to Frank Amos, and Dr. Bob Smith, who had written a short letter on September the 3rd outlining a request he wished to make of the other trustees. The meeting was completely focused on money and more particularly on their lack of money. Amos gave a treasurer's report noting there was still a balance of $2,000 from the Rockefeller contribution, along with a $500 check received from Charles Towns and an anonymous donation of $50. Frank also reported the Towns donation of $500 had already been distributed to Wilson, Parkhurst, and Mayo, and that was $150, $150, and $200 respectively, as the donor had requested. Finally, he reported the regular monthly payment of $200 had been sent to Dr. Bob Smith earlier that month.
Following this report, the first piece of new business was how to respond to Dr. Bob Smith's letter requesting the trustees take $400 from the money that would be paid to him in March and April of 1939 and give it, quote, at once to Mr. William G. Wilson and his associates, end quote. Since Rockefeller had donated these funds for Smith's exclusive use, this prompted a frank discussion which
disclosed that Messrs. W.G. Wilson and H.G. Parkhurst, indispensable leaders in this movement for the redemption of alcoholics, had used up all their private funds and had borrowed much money in carrying on this work, and that either some funds must be supplied them or they would have to seek private employment at once, of a nature which would take them away most of the time from this work, in which they are exceptionally capable leaders. The trustees decided that for some time to come, it would be vital to keep particularly Messrs. Wilson and Parkhurst in the New York metropolitan area entirely on this work, providing it were at all possible to secure funds which would barely meet their actual expenses. No other funds being available at this time, the trustees reluctantly accepted Dr. Smith's request and authorized the treasurer to pay this $400 over to Messrs. Wilson and Mayo. This decision was followed by the trustees reviewing the entire financial situation, quote unquote, at great length, and finally resolving that they would organize an, quote, informal meeting of the trustees with others interested in an effort to raise funds to carry on this work, end quote. Although the minutes do not say so, it is clear from comments Bill Wilson made shortly after this meeting that Richardson, parenthetically, most likely prompted by Frank Amos, end of parentheses, was considering the possibility of reapproaching John D. Rockefeller Jr. for more money. This, despite his employer's firm declaration the previous March that, quote, you will not look to me for a further contribution for this object, end quote. That pronouncement was so uncompromising that Richardson thought that such a request could only be made with the active support of Albert Scott, and it was agreed that he should be consulted on these matters as soon as possible because the immediate financial situation was so urgent. In preparation for that meeting, Amos asked Wilson to write out a fully detailed statement of their current financial distress, a document which could serve as a starting point for the planned discussion with Albert Scott the following Wednesday.
The proposed This Week article is discussed.
The final financial item to be discussed at the meeting was the proposed This Week magazine article, and this raised something of a moral dilemma for Bill. On the one hand, he was nervous about not mentioning their plan for national publicity to the trustees before making that commitment, but he was equally worried the Rockefeller men might veto the project and force them to cancel it outright once they learned the details of the proposal. Despite these fears, Bill Wilson launched into
a brief discussion of proposed publicity in the New York Herald Tribune magazine called This Week. It was suggested by Messrs. Parkhurst and Wilson that if such a step were taken promptly, new sources of contribution might be disclosed and that perhaps chapters of the book, now under preparation, could be sold to those seeking help. This would, they said, make a spiritual beginning in many homes and possibly permit Mr. Parkhurst and the office at Newark, New Jersey to be retained. All agreed that this course had its disadvantages, that it might not produce much revenue, that it might flood us with inquiries which we could not be looked after, that it might put us in the wrong light with the general public, that it might create the impression we were more interested in money than in spiritual matters.
Having noted in the course of this discussion that more chapters of the book were, quote unquote, now under preparation, Bill expanded on this by giving
a report on the progress of the book, which he has been writing, the purpose of which will be to give workers and alcoholics alike a powerful written help in pointing them toward spiritual redemption from alcoholism through reading of exactly how some 100 former alcoholics had been redeemed. There is much discussion as to the methods of publishing this book and promoting its sale, but nothing definite was decided.
In the end, the group simply ran out of time, and in addition to a lack of consensus about the best way to go about publishing and promoting their book, quote, no decision was made with respect to the Herald Tribune matter and its possible good or bad consequences, end quote. Although Wilson left this meeting with no clear solution to his dire financial situation, there was at least the hopeful possibility that Albert Scott could be persuaded to open a dialogue with John D. Rockefeller Jr. about making another and perhaps even more substantial contribution to the group.
Bill's letter paints a dire financial picture.
According to Frank Amos's suggestion for a summary document he would present to Albert Scott, Bill wrote one of the longest and most impressive impassioned letters of his life, in which he detailed, quote, the position with reference to our alcoholic work of Fitz Mayo, Hank Parkhurst, and myself. The opening line strikes a tragically biblical note, was classic Bill Wilson.
So far as I can see, we three have sold all our sheep and goats.
This was followed, he followed this dramatic opening with 2 paragraphs detailing Fitz Mayo's grave situation, noting that he
has gradually liquidated his livestock, equipment, and farm. His house only is left. He's also in debt to his sister, and he has no income of his own at all.
Unless Mayo could get some immediate relief, Wilson said,
he may be lost to us so far as much alcoholic work is concerned, and when our book comes out, we shall sorely need manpower of his kind.
Knowing Amos wanted him to be specific about their needs, Bill noted that Fitz could
scrape by for a while on $200 a month, but we'll need more eventually.
Hank Parkhurst was in even worse shape than Mayo, a situation Wilson described in some detail over the next several paragraphs. Hank's business was failing as he
has no income and is running into debt at an alarming rate. He is at least $2,000 in the hole now.
But more important, Hank's services
were going to be badly needed in the alcoholic work, which would obviously expand so much on publication of our book.
In fact, no one was better or more
effective with businessmen of his own type.
than Henry G. Parkhurst. In addition, Hank was needed for the critical role of
Looking after the publicity and distribution of the volume. There is no one in our crowd who has been sober long enough, has the business capacity and energy, and would be available, save Hank.
his services, Wilson declared categorically,
Will be invaluable.
in bringing the book to press and then promoting it. Added to Hank's personal expenses were the cost of maintaining the office and his secretary in New Jersey, which Bill notes are
Now useful to me because I am dictating the book there and looking after an ever-increasing correspondence.
It would, of course, be possible to close it down immediately and thereby save some money, but they would desperately need an office to deal with
The labor entailed by the huge volume of inquiries and pleas for assistance, which will surely descend upon us when the book is out.
Quite frankly, if that happened, and they had no office to serve as a base of operations,
The situation would be chaotic.
in addition, if
The equipment and furnishes we now possess
were sold off and had to be repurchased in just a few short months, it would.
cost $2,000 to duplicate them.
On the other hand, Bill estimated it would cost only
About $600 per month to carry Hank, the office, and a secretary.
during the brief time before the book's publication, which would then begin to generate the income needed to sustain themselves. Wilson's own situation was hardly any better. His
Wall Street income had stopped.
the previous fall, and although he has
Since been made director of a promising company,
the fees paid by this Midwest firm were only nominal. To make things worse, he was in debt.
during the past year, so that I could keep on and have a free hand with this work, I have gone $1,500 into debt. I have given my personal notes for $1,200. This money was shared with Hank and Fitz. Contributions amounting to $1,500 were secured from Mr. Charles B. Towns. This money was likewise divided among the three of us and has all been spent.
Having brought up the subject of Charles Towns, Wilson next went into a long discussion recounting his past relationship with the New York City Hospital and its owner, telling the trustees how Towns had offered him a job and the subsequent decision to reject that offer, along with any other kind of formal affiliation with the locally famous Drying Out spot.
We did not go along with Mr. Towns at the time because we felt there was a better way. We did not want any man's chance of finding his God and getting over his alcoholism prejudiced by accusations, however ill-founded, that we were too commercial. On this point, we have been bending over backward ever since, and I am very glad we have. But our financial backs have been broken with the bending.
Moving ahead on a less than ideal basis.
Having effectively eliminated Charles Towns and his hospital as a potential source of income, Bill states, in a not too subtle reference to John D. Rockefeller Jr., that the ideal solution would be to
have access to adequate funds given by understanding people quietly and without expectation of personal publicity or reward.
Although he realizes that this is a quote-unquote ideal setup, and perhaps we cannot have that, nevertheless,
we could well use $30,000 during the coming year to place the knowledge of our solution in every home and to follow up this initial step. It will be unfortunate if we bring out a book which is sure to create a huge demand for help, at least by correspondence, and then be totally unprepared to take care of the situation. Though the book alone will undoubtedly do much good, it will fall short of this objective if publication finds us without men or money to carry it through. It is imperative we be ready. This is no time to bog down. The next 6 months are critical. The general work ought to be pushed and a foundation built that will withstand the pressure which is inevitably coming. As there are no funds yet in sight to carry the work upon the ideal basis we would like, we are plainly faced with the question as to whether we should go ahead on something less than an ideal basis, or shall we stick to our vision of the ideal, yet accomplish little or nothing for the lack of money. For example, we could let the status of the work revert to where it was a year ago. Those of us now active could go back to business. In that event, we might continue to grow at such a rate that perhaps several hundred more men would be reached over the next few years. But what shall we say to the many thousand who might pass out of the picture just because we failed to let them know? May they not be obliged to suffer because we are now too timid, too conservative, or too fearful of what people may say. Assuming that the trustees, by private contribution, think it unlikely we can take care of the situation, should we not consider other means? The New York Herald Tribune, for example, seems willing to carry an article descriptive of our work, which would guardedly disclose our need for funds. I refer to their Sunday magazine called This Week. This section of the Tribune is widely syndicated. It has a weekly circulation of 7 millions. Perhaps it would bring our work to the attention of several 100,000 families where the alcoholic problem exists. The managing editor of This Week thinks that 20,000 of them would get in touch with us. We could offer these families, say, 5 of the vital chapters of our book in photolithographic form. We would frankly let them know about our finances and the necessity for money to publish the book and take care of this aftermath. We could ask them $1 for these chapters. Admittedly, this is not the best possible approach, but would it not be better than to drift? Frankly, I don't know. We would much like the advice of the trustees on this point.
Bill next revisited the possibility of making some kind of commercial arrangement with Towns Hospital. Parenthesis.
Again, I am not sure. What do the trustees think?
And then offered yet another option, one in which he would
concentrate entirely on the book, letting Fitz and Hank in the office out of active participation.
But even this would cost a significant amount of money.
These expenses, allowing myself $250 a month to cover everything, will amount to $1,500 for 6 months. To sum up then, it seems doubtful whether the status quo of all 3 of us can be maintained during the month of October for less than $1,000. That would be $600 to Hank in the office, $200 to Fitz, and $200 to me. Perhaps Fitz can get through October without any more money, though he could certainly use it. In any event, he will be flat on November 1st, unless the Washington businessmen pick up the lead.
6 pointed questions for the trustees.
Having spent the better part of 6 pages arriving at this inescapable and unpleasant conclusion, Wilson then organized all of these details into 6 comprehensive questions which he challenged the trustees to answer.
With the foregoing in mind, does it not seem proper that the trustees consider and perhaps come to some conclusion at their next meeting on the following questions? 1. Assuming that contributions can be obtained, should the foundation attempt to maintain the 3 of us in active work for, let us say, 6 months? 2. Should the trustees decide that status quo should be maintained, how are we going to do that for the month of October? 3. Do the trustees think there's a real likelihood that we can maintain the status quo of $1,000 a month for 6 months on the basis of private contributions only? 4. In the event the trustees think it improbable we can maintain the status quo for 6 months by private contribution, what is their pleasure with respect to the proposal we augment our income through the Herald Tribune publicity, the sale of book chapters, and perhaps a closer working arrangement with Mr. Towns? 5. If the trustees think it impossible or undesirable to maintain the status quo by any of the foregoing methods, what do they think of the proposal that I continue alone on the book? 6. If it is decided I continue on the book, what is their advice as to how I should be financed? Should I immediately commit myself to Mr. Towns or not?
These were not rhetorical questions. Bill was genuinely looking for answers and insisting his Rockefeller friends not only acknowledge the reality of their dire situation and parenthetically their own complete failure to raise any money during the several past months, close parenthesis, but also make a serious effort to formulate a working solution for these pressing problems. Bill did, however, manage to temper this insistence a bit in his closing statement.
Though I have expressed some personal views, I would like to make clear I shall not be at all disturbed if they are vetoed. Hank and Fitz and I are sensible that our thinking at this time of financial embarrassment may be warped. We would like the trustees to help us guard against this possibility. We must at all costs avoid being driven into arrangements we might later regret. Though we are grateful we have you gentlemen to go to, we do not want to cast too much responsibility on the shoulders of our ever-willing trustees. Let us say once more how much we appreciate the time and devotion which you, Frank, Mr. Richardson, Mr. Chipman, Mr. Scott, and Mr. Wood have given this undertaking. Please do not take our problems too seriously. After all, God has a way of working things out if we are willing to be used as he would like. Sincerely yours, William G. Wilson.
Challenging the Rockefeller trustees. Now, the previous December, Bill Wilson had forged what seemed to be an amazingly fortunate alliance with 4 of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s closest associates in the hope that, with their help, he would be able to open the wallets of wealthy New Yorkers and garner substantial contributions for their cause. 9 months later, Richardson, Amos, Chipman, and Scott had been responsible for facilitating just one donation, $5,000 from John D. himself, with absolutely no money coming from any of their other many contacts and recommendations. Wilson's frustration with this complete failure and the dwindling prospect that this plan would produce any positive results in the near future was fast eroding what little remained of his original confidence that Rockefeller Group would be their passport to financial security.
With his 6 pointed questions, Bill Wilson had thrown down the gauntlet, giving the Rockefeller men one last chance to propose a solution to their disastrous situation. Despite the conciliatory closing paragraphs, Wilson knew if these men could not come up with a realistic and viable way for them to support themselves throughout the next 6 months, then other means, perhaps even arrangements they might later regret, would have to be entertained. Whatever might happen, Bill Wilson had no intention of walking away from his plan to rapidly expand the reach of their program of recovery, even if such a decision required him to take several giant steps away from the Rockefeller connection that had originally held out so much hope and promise. On September 27th, the day after he wrote this long letter, Bill explained to Silas Bent the extent and import of their current dilemma with the trustees and the reason he had not yet contacted This Week magazine.
As you know, the Alcoholic Foundation has 5 trustees, 3 of whom are closely related to the source from which we have already derived some funds, and from which it looks as though we presently might get some more. I favor the Herald Tribune publicity at this time because it would bring in a great number of inquiries for help. To the people who wrote in, we could send 5 vital chapters of our book, the backbone of it. We might charge $1 for these chapters and thus make enough profit on them to help us over the tight spot we are in now. A considerable advance demand for the book might be created. Actual contributions or sources thereof might come to light. I am urging these points upon the trustees. It seemed to me that they should be consulted and their approval secured before we go to bat or money or no money. We want to do this thing in the best possible way. One of the trustees, Mr. Frank Amos, approved the Herald Tribune project, but as luck would have it, we cannot get down to cases with the other two until next week. So I have not gone to the Tribune, or if by an off chance the trustees felt this publicity unwise at the moment, we might feel quite uncomfortable. Though I suppose I occupy in an unofficial way a position of considerable authority in this work, I do not think it wise for me in a case like this to take action first and tell the trustees afterwards. I am sure you will agree.
Wilson was hoping the Rockefeller trustees would endorse his plan to publish the story, and he was also at this point still reluctant to go against their wishes or advice. He did not want to place himself in the uncomfortable position of acting before receiving their approval, but his stance would change dramatically with their subsequent failure to come up with a reliable means of ongoing support for them. Bill's sheeps and goats letter was, in fact, the last time he would throw himself and his growing movement at the feet of these four men in such an abject way. Their failure to raise money for him and his team left him with no choice but to turn away from these rich friends and become more receptive to the promotional and profit-making schemes Hank Parkhurst was constantly suggesting. The time was fast approaching when, in desperation, Bill would begin to exercise his, quote, position of considerable authority in this work, end quote, and start taking actions that were contrary to the advice being offered by the Rockefeller men.
The question of views is raised.
Bill had told Silas Bent that John D. Rockefeller Jr. might be considering another contribution, and, quote, it looks as though we presently might get some more money from him. That same day, Wilson also wrote to Bob Smith, telling him of the renowned preacher, Dr. Emerson Fosdick, was back in town, and that A. Leroy Chipman planned to enlist his support in their cause. And then, once his, quote, enthusiasm is aroused, I think the boys intend to use that as a means of putting some heat on the big chief, end quote. But more than Fosdick, Wilson's highest hopes were pinned on Albert Scott, whom Frank Amos had agreed to approach and arrange a meeting so that the money issue would be discussed in detail. Bill was confident Scott would be able to broker a deal that included another Rockefeller contribution and thereby resolve the laundry list of intractable financial problems he had presented to the foundation. Although Bill referred to it as a quote-unquote trustee meeting, the meeting with Albert Scott was held on Wednesday, September 28th, was not a formal gathering of the Alcoholic Foundation, and no official minutes were kept of what happened there. Scott sat down with Frank Amos and most likely A. Leroy Chipman, and possibly even Willard Richardson, but there were no alcoholics invited. Bill's expansive letter and his 6 pointed questions were the only presents they had at the meeting. The letter did, however, provide the primary focus of the discussion as Albert Scott was sounded out on whether or not he thought it might be a good idea to approach John D. Rockefeller Jr. for another contribution. He did not. Instead, Scott took a completely different and unexpected turn, insisting that the members of Alcoholics show good faith by taking primary responsibility for the financing of their own organization before he would be willing to make any suggestion to Rockefeller or to anyone else about further donations to their cause. He wanted Wilson and Parkhurst to approach their members and ask, quote, each alcoholic to contribute something, however little, to the Alcoholic Foundation regularly, preferably weekly, end quote. Scott considered this demonstration of self-support, quote unquote, absolutely vital as a preliminary, end quote, to secure, quote, any larger subscription from outside sources. This was not the first or the last time that a proposal of enforced regular dues for AA membership would be made, but Scott's in transit at this time made it one of the most fateful presentations of that day and that idea in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wilson and Parkhurst felt it left them with no other option than to begin significantly distancing themselves from their Rockefeller colleagues.
Bill and Hank reject the dues idea.
The day after the meeting, Frank Amos invited Bill and Hank to his office and told them of Scott's fixed position on the question of financing. In a letter he wrote to Albert Scott the following Tuesday, Amos said that on hearing this news, Wilson and Parkhurst, quote, endeavored to canvass the situation from every angle, end quote, but could not in the end find any way they could agree on his proposal. For their perspective and from their perspective and experience, it was wrong on far too many levels.
They feared the results of such a plan at this time and stressed the following pertinent points. 1. Every ex-alcoholic, to be sure of remaining permanently sober, must keep active, working with others for their emancipation. Otherwise, they definitely face a recurrence of the disease with death or the insane asylum as their destination. Therefore, regular dues are not necessary to keep them active or interested. 2. Every ex-alcoholic with any funds whatever is being called on constantly to contribute to the desperate needs of others who are destitute. Their wives and families, seeing personally this need, do not object seriously to these individual gifts. 3. The moment this work is put on what they would consider a dues-paying basis, the wives would want to know the purpose of these dues. When it became known, as it soon would, that this money was to provide for 2 or 3 leaders, it would cause serious problems in many families. Family dissension is frequently a factor in causing an ex-drunk to drop the X. We must all remember that this situation is different from the average church, service club, or nonprofit organization. In most cases, the wives and families have suffered cruelly for years through the husband's depravity. Now that they are redeemed, it is only natural that these wives expect their husbands to concentrate their meager resources on providing food, clothing, education, etc. They will respond to desperate individual cases before their own eyes and are doing it liberally, but they rebel against systematic dues to a central organization. 4. Even where they accepted the regular contribution idea and, quote, came through, end quote, they then would feel that all requests for relief should be referred to the Alcoholic Foundation. As we are not the U.S. government with taxing power and ability to issue IOUs, we could not and should not, for some time to come, undertake to finance the general rehabilitation costs. The individual help, man to man, is vital and should be continued indefinitely. 5. Last February, Parkhurst put the proposition of monthly contributions up to a large number of the New York alcoholics who accepted the plan in principle. Several of the wives, however, raised a kick, and the plan was abandoned for the time being. Upon being consulted, Dr. Smith advised emphatically that such a plan attempted at present with the Akron crowd would be demoralizing.
These are strong and persuasive counterarguments, and Frank Amos agreed with them wholeheartedly. Quote, "For 9 months," he told Scott, "I've been in almost daily touch with this work. It is my conviction that we should not yet attempt this organized giving. When large numbers of the ex-alcoholics become rehabilitated economically, such a plan should be evolved," end quote. But definitely not now.
Amos's alternate plan.
Despite this unanimous disagreement, Albert Scott's reputation and his close personal relationship with Rockefeller required nothing less than a respectful response. "After you read this memorandum," Frank Amos allowed, quote, "if you are still convinced," end quote, "such a move is, quote unquote, vital, then," quote, "both gentlemen agree to have me go before their crowd to present this proposal." Clearly, Wilson and Parkhurst were intent on distancing themselves as far as possible from this suggestion, placing the full responsibility for the scheme, parenthesis, and whatever fallout might occur from it, close parenthesis, directly on Frank Amos and his 3 Rockefeller friends. In the hopes that Scott would not require him to do something that he and these 2 men completely disagreed with, Amos offered his own alternative plan for responding to Bill Wilson's 6 questions. At this point, he recommended,
A, that the 4 of us, you, Richardson, Chipman, and myself, endeavor at once to raise $10,000. B, that we ascertain what advance we can get from a publisher of the book, and this might be sufficient for Will's fair expenses while writing it. C, that Parkhurst continue until November 1st to try and secure contributions. D, that Parkhurst handle with Miss Hock, the secretary, such office detail as is necessary until November the 1st. E, if by November 1st all of our efforts have failed to secure sufficient funds to maintain Parkhurst's secretary and office until April 1st, that we abandon for the present the suggestion to take over the Newark office and leave Parkhurst free to re-enter business on a full-time basis. And F, that we maintain the principle that the work among alcoholics must be voluntary, and that we endeavour for as long a period as necessary to provide funds so that Wilson can pursue his work as an author of the 100 Men, and Parkhurst can handle the business end of our operations.
Amos closed his letter to Scott by noting that he was quote unquote crowded with rush work and trying to clear his desk before leaving on Friday morning for a 3-week vacation. He would therefore not be available for a private conversation to give full information on anything that might have been left out of the memo. Instead, he provided Scott with Bill's contact information and suggested,
you ask Wilson to come to your office as soon as convenient for you. He can make clear any point and give you the correct picture.
Whether or not Albert Scott ever called Bill for that appointment is unknown, but his insistence that AA become self-supporting by instituting a policy of enforced weekly dues was not implemented. It's also not clear to what degree Scott and the others ever embraced Amos's suggestion that they commit themselves to quickly raising $10,000 to support the 3 men until the following April. Whatever efforts they may have made, no such sum was ever raised. On the other hand, Frank's all-important question, quote, that we ascertain what advances we can get from the publisher on the book, end quote, would in just a few days lead Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst, in defiance of the advice they were receiving from the Rockefeller contingent, to embark upon an ambitious plan to publish the book 100 Men on their own.
To avoid any confusion, it is important to emphasize that the name of the proposed book at this point was not Alcoholics Anonymous, but rather 100 Men. That title was first suggested by Ebby Thatcher's brother Tom when he wrote his proposed introduction entitled Victors Anonymous the previous June. At that time, both Wilson and Parkhurst had enthusiastically adopted the name, and it was one they had bandied about with regularity whenever they spoke about the proposed book during the following months. From this point in early October of 1938 up until mid-February of 1939, the title 100 Men would become much more prominent in all their correspondence and other preserved documents, being constantly mentioned as the name of the proposed book and also as the name of the corporation. Hank Parkhurst would soon organize in an effort to raise money for the book project. The decision that led to the selection of Alcoholics Anonymous as the title of the big book was still several months away.
This week, article rejected.
Like the ill-fated Washington Project, the possibility of publishing an article in This Week magazine limped along for another 2 months before it was decisively rejected by the publisher on November 25th. Silas Bent had advised Bill on September 21st that he should call on the magazine's managing editor, Gerald Mygott, but that appointment was delayed by the excitement of the late September trustee meetings, Wilson's ongoing writing for the book, and Parkhurst's aggressive efforts to raise money.
Almost 2 months later, Bill finally wrote to the editor, reminding him of his earlier request for changes to Silas Bent's article, and of Silas's promise that he and Hank Parkhurst would be calling to offer their assistance in making those changes. Bill apologized for the immoderate delay, but offered no other explanation than to say there were, quote, unquote, several reasons we could not see you then, end quote. More important, he wanted to correct Magot's impression that this piece was no longer relevant because, quote, an article about our work, end quote, had recently been published by a competing publication, the American Weekly. Wilson assured Magot that
the article in the magazine had no relation to our activities whatever, so I assume that you are still interested.
Bill then ended by playing what he must have considered to be a powerful trump card.
Mr. W.S. Richardson, secretary to Mr. John D. Rockefeller Jr., knows about us. He has given us much of his time and effort. It turns out he is a friend of Mrs. Maloney, the owner of This Week magazine, and has been good enough to let her know that you may rely upon what we say. Mr. Parkhurst and I would like very much to call as soon as you are at liberty.
Flurry of correspondence went back and forth between Wilson, Amos, Mygat, Richardson, and Maloney for 2 weeks before the owner finally replied with finality, quote, "This piece is not for us," end quote. This must have been tremendously disappointing for Wilson and Parkhurst. Bill had done everything he could to get This Week to run the article, including sending Willard Richardson a sample of some language he thought should be used in the letter to Mrs. Maloney, parentheses, which Richardson ignored, writing his own text instead, close parentheses, all to no avail.
This appears to be another one of the fortunate failures that so dominate the early history of Alcoholics Anonymous. If an article had been printed in This Week magazine, which had a national circulation of at least 5 million copies in September or November of 1938, it may well have proved more disastrous than beneficial to the fledgling movement. The article might have produced an overwhelming response and thousands of requests for help, requests that were simply not capable of dealing with at a time when they had less than 100 members, just 2 weekly meetings, no books explaining their method for staying sober, and no infrastructure in place for organizing and responding to those desperate requests.
When Jack Alexander's famous article on AA appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, which had a national circulation of 3 million copies on March 1st, 1941, it did produce a tidal wave of attention and requests for help. But by that time, the movement now had 2,000 members and a book of instructions on how to stay sober, along with meetings that were springing up all over the country, and a New York office that, however understaffed, had been functional for more than 2 years. The rejection of Silent Bent's article by This Week magazine was a very large blessing in disguise for Alcoholics Anonymous.
Unmute yourselves. That's the end of the chapter 13, This Week magazine.
Thank you, readers. Thank you, Bill.
Thank
That
you.
was phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Reading was
That's
fantastic.
really, really good.
Thank you, readers. Thank you, Bill.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
What a great
Great
chapter.
chapter.
Amazing.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
You readers really make this come alive. I say that every week, but it's just brilliant. Thank
Good,
you.
aren't they? They're very
Yeah.
good.
That was a lot of work.
There's a lot of work. And they don't even rehearse it. I don't think. Bill Schaberg done a little bit of direction there today, I thought. I thought he did a little bit of direction, but I think it worked, Bill. You and Jim done very well. I have to say you done exceptionally well.
The Monty Python players.
Yeah.
I think this chapter should have been called try to no avail, or try again. I mean, how discouraging, no matter what they did.
Right, well,
Yeah.
let's go and see
Yeah.
what Mr. Schaberg says.
Thank you, David. I got to tell you, I love this Sheeps and Goats letter. I love this letter. And when I found it, I was absolutely floored by all the details in there. It was just amazing. Here's this amazing snapshot of what's going on in late September of 1938 for these 3 guys and what's going on. It was just, man, I was really, really knocked out by it. A couple of things, though, as always, when we're reading this thing, I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. You would think all the times we've been over this that wouldn't be the case, but that's just how human beings, not just me, that's how we work, you know? I mean, I still find things in the big book. It's like, when the hell did they put that in there? You know, I've been reading the big book for years. So in the letter, Wilson states, this jumped out at me. I've never noticed this before. And he said, for example, we could let the status of the work revert to what it was a year ago. Well, a year ago for September 27th, 38 is September 27th, 37, which is 2 weeks before they go up to Akron for the Counting Noses meeting, you know, which is, so he's clearly seeing that as a turning point and being referenced right here without, you know, it's implied, but a year ago. So a year ago, they weren't doing jack. They weren't doing, you know, there was nothing at all organized at all at that point. So I thought that was just wickedly interesting. And then on 263, I look at the bottom, he says, closing the letter, he says, after all, God has a way of working out if we are willing to be used as he would like. Later, when they're up at Cornwell Press and they don't have enough money to get out of the hotel, Bill comments that Hank just said, just spend the money. He had come to the belief, certainly, that just spend the money and God will take care of it. Well, Wilson seems to be saying exactly the same thing here. So I thought that was nice. And most especially, I noticed that Wilson does these 6 points. You know, he's doing a summation of what's, you know, in case you missed the point, dude, let me just tell you what's going on here. Here's these things we got to get taken care of. And it put me in mind of the very first, when you look at the Multilith copy and to employers, and Hank's all over the place through the whole chapter, you get to the end and there's 10 points at the end. Just to clarify, there's 10 points in the end, which, I mean, I could allege or guess or hope to understand that Bill Wilson did the 10 points trying to clarify the confusions that came before it, and then Hank took it back out again. Now, I'm not sure Wilson wrote those 10 points, and I'm not sure that Hank took them back out again, but certainly they are in the Multilith and they're not in the big book, and that's as good a story as any, in my opinion. And last but not least, when Gerald Mayat rejects the thing, he actually says, there is hope, and puts it in quotation marks. I'm like, I never noticed that before. The very first publicity for Alcoholics Anonymous is an article written by, Silas Bent, and it appears in January of 1939 in the Hackensack Courier. And what's the title of the article? There is hope. There is hope. So I wonder if Silas just took what he had written for this magazine and compressed it, or maybe that was all he wrote for the magazine and didn't get it. So anyhow, it's just amazing, you know. Keep seeing things. There's these little subtle connections that are buried right there in plain sight, except I don't see them.
I just love that the author, Bill Shaverg, historian, is still seeing things in his own work. I just love that. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. And we're going to Jim Worley out of AA History Only on Facebook, of course. We all dip in and out of that, Jim, every day. Thank you for that.
Thank you, David, and everyone. I don't have much. I agree with what Bill pointed out there, and the fact that every time I read this, I see something new in it. And but the one there at the end that jumped out at me. You know, somebody said, well, this ought to be titled, we tried and didn't get anything, and but that sentence, it says, this appears to be another one of the fortunate failures. I like that phrase, that so dominate the early history of Alcoholics Anonymous. So many things that at the time appear to be failures that, what's Bill say? On what slender threads, our destiny sometimes hangs. And some of those slender threads appear at the time to be failures. And that's just a little note there. But thanks, everybody.
Thank
you, Jim. Good job.
We have a queue. I think we have Bill for about 20 minutes or so.
15.
Well, I was trying to get an extra 5 out of you, Bill, but thank you. We got Bill for 15 minutes. Does anyone want to come in and ask? I mean, there was such great information in that, wasn't there, already? Mike, are you coming in? Mike from Calgary? No, Mike is okay. Dina, you got something for us? What have you got, Dina? Dina's on fire at the moment.
Yes.
She's loving it.
Hey everybody, I'm Dean T, alcoholic.
Like
Thank you
DT.
so much for everybody that reads, and that does make it come alive. And thank you so much for being here. So what I always want to say is, why didn't somebody just go get a job? You know, I don't understand that. That's the part I kind of don't get. And it's, you know, are they doing that all day? They're working on this book all day. Really, you can't just go get some kind of job, pull it together, right? And then you kind of describe that. But I still say, why did they? What? I must be missing something. And then love that part on page 266 where it says, every alcoholic, to be sure of remaining permanently sober, must keep active working with others. And that's just beautiful. I love that. So I put stars by some stuff, but that job thing kind of bugs me. Thank you.
It's an interesting observation, but I think they were really, Hank's trying to keep the business going, and that's not working. And Jimmy Burwell's out there working for him, and that's not working. And so there's just not a lot of money coming in. There's a great letter that Dr. Bob writes, or somebody, it must be Dr. Bob writes, and he goes out to dinner with his wife to friends in Akron, and falls asleep at the dinner table because he'd been out until 3 o'clock in the morning with some drunk. So these guys are really putting in the time, as far as I can tell. I mean, I just love that story of Bob falling asleep. You can just imagine going face down in the plate, at the dinner party with the neighbors, and and of course, it's funny. I've been talking to Kevin Hanlon about this because we're talking about like 1942. What kind of job would Bill Wilson have gotten in 1942? And Kevin hasn't gotten back to me on this, but my radical suggestion was that Bill Wilson go out and get himself a stockbroker license and then become a stockbroker for all these rich guys coming in AA and getting sober. They could say, oh, well, Bill Wilson's my financial advisor, and hell, you would think a whole bunch of people would commit to that. Now, I'm sure Kevin's going to have a whole bunch of complaints and bitches about why that wasn't possible at all. And it would have been absolutely the worst thing for Alcoholics Anonymous and blah, 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 blah. But anyhow, Kevin will be out here for lunch in a couple of weeks, and he'll take me apart on that, I'm sure. So anyhow, it's great. It's great. And it's 1938, DT. There's no freaking jobs. It's still the Depression.
DT, I like that.
Well, that's what she said, and I liked it too. I thought that was cool. She introduced herself as DT.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's great. Dina, that's great. Dina T. DT. And we're going to Joel M. in Arizona.
Yes. The whole discussion or the read on why they rejected the dues and they kind of blamed it on the wives didn't feel like that was true. Why did they blame it on the wives? I would think the membership would have rejected the whole dues idea. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, one of my thoughts, I just did this thing on to wives, and blaming the wives is like, just read Genesis for God's sakes, Eve gets the short end of the stick there, and so, blaming the wives is perfect. If I had the money, I'd probably give you some money, but if I had the money and I gave you the money, my wife would bitch about it, and I have enough trouble at home without going home and justifying that kind of stuff going on here. So what I really loved was, this is in February of 1938. This supposedly takes place when they finally find out about, John D. Rockefeller giving them only $5,000. But the only place that shows up is in this letter from Frank Amos. There's no documentary evidence for it in February. It doesn't show up until this September letter. But again, it's one of those things when I'm doing these letters and I see this. You mean Frank Parker? Hank Parkhurst was trying to get him he put up a proposal that they actually give weekly contributions. I didn't know that, And then of course it says in the letter, in Frank Amos's letter, that when they mentioned it to Dr. Bob, he went, I can just imagine, money's going to spoil this thing was something that was going on all the time out in Akron, Ohio. So God forbid we have to, now you want me to cough up the cash? It's bad enough you're looking for money, but you want it from me?
Thank you for that, Joel. And Randy's back with us. Hello, Randy E. from Ontario.
Hi, Bill. Thank you to all the readers for wonderful presentation today. Thank you. Got a question on the article that possibly was in the American Weekly magazine. This week it's rejected. You mentioned the There Is Hope is in Hackettstown, but that's the first time, well, it stuck out to me today about that particular article, page 269 in the American Weekly, where it says it had no relation to our activities whatever. Any information on that or any of the other historians?
I've never gone digging for that one. Jim, have you gone digging? Jim's my digger for this kind of stuff, or he knows a digger he could assign that a task to, perhaps.
I haven't. I have dug for it. I have come up with an empty shovel. I've dug around looking for that because it appears to be something that might have been related to alcoholism or whatever. And perhaps our other shoveler and rabbit holder, Hugh, has his hand up. Maybe he's found something.
Thank you very much, Bill. You and Jim.
And let me just say before Hugh jumps in here, because Hugh's another one of these guys, but when you ask me a question I don't know anything about and I've never done any research on, for me to be able to say, I'm confident you need to talk to Jim Worley, or to Hugh, those two guys are always doing that. And it's a testimony to the great work they're doing that's the first thing that pops into mind. I'm going to pass this question off to one of those two guys. Hugh?
Yeah, I have certainly seen an article from American Weekly. If I remember correctly, it was written by a woman named Parkhurst. No relation, maybe Genevieve Parkhurst. It was a big spread, 2 pages, on like newspaper size, as I recall. I'm trying to find it in my files, but I probably put it under. I tend to put things by date order, so if I had the date, I could find it quickly, but I haven't found it yet. If I do, I'll put a copy of it in the chat.
That would be great. Or if you could email that thing to Jim and I, that would be outstanding. Randy's raising his hand too. He's over. If I get it, Randy, I'll send it to you.
Thank you, Hugh. And thanks to all the readers today. Another wonderful presentation.
Thank you, guys. That's great stuff. I'm going to Robert J.
Yes, thank you, Bill, for your lovely presentation. Well, what about the Reader's Digest back in the day? Did they try them?
Oh yeah, we're going to get to that further on. That was they were promised an article in the Reader's Digest by the guy who ran the magazine, and then when they come back and they say, okay, remember when we were here and you told us you were going to do that, and he says, oh yeah, I took that to the board and they said no, and I forgot to tell you. It was one of those kind of deals. So, and at one point, Hank Parkhurst has a guy from the Reader's Digest come and attend the meeting. I think that was in June of 1938, hoping to get him jacked up so he would write an article. And as far as we know, nothing happened with that. So, Jim, are you waving your hand?
Yeah. Just there we go. The only thing I remember that article that Hugh mentioned that was in the I'm trying, but anyway, but it was later. Genevieve Parkhurst actually wrote several articles on that, but I never found one earlier than early enough to be that particular one referenced that early in AA history.
You're probably right, Jim. I think I'm thinking of an earlier or later one.
Yeah. This one was, for example, alcoholism and July 18th, 1941.
Layman joined science to cure it.
Yeah.
I remember that subtitle.
Okay, yeah, but I never could find one earlier than that.
I'll do my own research.
Yeah.
See if I
Gotta,
can find it.
gotta love nitpicking AA historians. That's beautiful stuff, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Get the
Oh, here's another nitpicker got her hand up.
action. We get to witness it in action. Gigi.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, readers. David, you did a brilliant job breaking it down into a script. That was amazing. My question has to do with compliance. When Gerald Mygott came back to them and said, you need this and you need this, why didn't they just write that?
Well, they
Why
wanted
didn't he
to.
just, I know they wanted to sell it, but why didn't they just synopsize it a little bit for a little teaser?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, now I'm guessing. I'm guessing here.
Okay.
I'm not speculating here. I'm guessing. That's speculation is have a little bit of, feeling of I'm guessing that Parkhurst didn't want to do that. That would reduce the number of people who would send him $1, Now I don't know that for a fact, but it would be interesting to see what Bill's edited story might have looked like, even if they had packaged it into here's an example, right? So they had a third of a page or a half a page or even a full page of that kind of stuff. I don't really know. Wilson edited his own story pretty aggressively in 1943 for the first AA pamphlet. The first it's AA, and it's got Bill Wilson's story in it, edited. Dr. Bob's story in it, edited. Doppler's story in it, the European Drinker, edited, and it's the first appearance of Marty Mann's story in that particular pamphlet. But Sally had me up at Stepping Stones one time, and she says, I found a copy of the Big Book that Bill Wilson marked up. I think he was trying to edit the Big Book, and she showed it to me, and it took me a long time to realize. I made like 3 trips up there to go over all that stuff. But what it was he was doing the edits that actually showed up in this first pamphlet. And that's just fascinating to me. And I mentioned that I need to package my archive to go to Brown University, and one of the things they want is the marked up copy of that book. And I'm like, I got to do all those markings in another copy of the book because I got to keep something here, and that's something that I don't want going out the door because nobody seems to know that, And one of the things in the book here, I talk about Wilson wanting to edit it and not being able to edit it, and
we lost you, Bill.
but there's nothing like that. It could be another couple of pages in this book, which I am not going to do. But I did want to have that thing available to people. So.
Well, I think we're coming to the end. I want to ask this question because I think it's Bill. It's up on the screen for us. How significant is this moment here, Bill, when Parkhurst and Wilson, in defiance of the advice they were receiving from the Rockefeller contingent, they embarked upon an ambitious plan to publish the book? That's a huge turning point in the history of it, Bill. If they hadn't went that way, yeah.
Yeah. I mean. And again, it's Parkhurst has this rose-colored glasses on about how successful all these business ventures he's got going are going to be, and but yeah, I think it's one of those big deals where they just said, yeah, they're gonna take off, they're gonna print their own book.
It took a lot of courage, didn't it, Bill? But it took a lot of courage to do that, because they were cutting their hand off. Maybe they were cutting off the resources where they were getting the funding from. No,
I don't know that courage comes to mind.
Okay.
Stupidity comes to mind, but that's the wrong word. That's too far over on this side of the negative side of the spectrum, But I think it's remarkably ambitious.
There you go. That's it.
And I suspect a bit out of touch with what's needed to actually publish a book successfully. I mean, how do you distribute the damn book? What are you going to do? And they take this one advertisement in the New York Times on April 11th, 1939. But how do you get the word out there? We're going to go word of mouth. The same way the program's been going is word of mouth, and that's how they got to 2,000 members by the time they get to March of 1941. 2 years later, they got 2,000 members, but that's the kind of word of mouth thing. But then that Saturday Evening Post article comes out, and boom, 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 everything goes.
We're just going to close up, but we're back. Bill is not with us tomorrow. I don't think Jim is with us, but we're going to have a discussion meeting. There was a number. We had about 25 people last week, which thank you for everyone who turned up. It was just a discussion, a chat about what we read today, and we looked at another chapter as well. So we're just looking at that. So if you want to come in on that tomorrow night, 8 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. It's right in the big book, The Creation of AI. We're calling it a discussion meeting and a reflection on what we read today. Or maybe you want to ask a question. We listened to the Q&A last week as well. I thought it was good to go back over that and listen to it again. So that was kind of really informative. Now we're going to close today. Bill, thank you ever so much. I can't thank you enough, sir. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone. Wonderful stuff. Bill Shaberg, back to you, sir.
All right. A moment of silence, please. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost. Each of us should strive to awaken to the present moment. Take heed. Tonight, your days are diminished by one. Do not squander the few days you might have left in your life today.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jim, and all our
Thank
readers.
you, Bill. Thank you,
Thank you
David.
all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dean.
Bill.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Bill. What a
Everybody.
Back
fantastic-
time. Send
Yeah,
back
thank you,
channel.
everybody. And thank you, David.
Loving it,
Thank you,
man.
Bill.
Thank you very much for
Thank you,
having me.
kid.
Mwah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good
Gigi.
night.
Thank you.